It's always funny to me when an athlete has some mannerisms on the field that he doesn't have off the field. I'm a Steelers fan, and so Troy Polamalu was a legendary Steeler. Man, he was a maniac on the field. In fact, they called him the Tasmanian. One of his many nicknames was the Tasmanian Devil. I mean, he was all over the place, just crushing people, jumping over the offensive line. If some of you, he's been retired for 3 or 4 years now. If you've never seen any highlights of this guy, man, look him up. He was awesome. On the field, he was crazy, the Tasmanian Devil. Off the field, he was a very mild, soft-spoken guy that you might recognize more from Head & Shoulders commercials. And if you heard him talk on these Head & Shoulders commercials, he had a really quiet and calm, just he was almost a pacifist in the way he talks, and really his beliefs kind of lead him to that sort of way. And he's just one of those guys that on the field he was one way, and off the field he just seemed completely different. It's also funny when actors are that way. Maybe an actor plays a part that you recognize, and then you see that actor out of that role, and it's kind of weird. It's probably the weirdest for me with this guy. If you watch The Office, Dwight was the guy who was just easy to hate and funny, just a really funny character. You hope that you never work with a guy like that. But then you see him and listen to him not in that role in real life, and it's so different. It's just weird to see the difference between who he is when he's an actor, when he's acting, and then who he is in real life. My favorite example of this probably is Mike Tyson. I'm not going to show you a picture of Mike Tyson, but man, he would just pummel people, right? Just pummel people, bite their ears off, stuff like that. And then I'm not going to try to imitate his voice, but you ever heard him talk? Yeah. You think, is that the same person? Is that voice really coming out of that giant of a beast of a boxer? And it's just weird to see somebody, and funny sometimes, to see somebody who's one way in one setting and then completely different in another setting. It happens with athletes, happens with actors. And while that's funny, it's really discouraging when someone you know is one way when they're in front of you, and then you discover that in reality their lifestyle has not matched up with who they claim to be. I'm guessing that some of you have experienced that before. You've known somebody, maybe at church, that you really respected and really loved. And here's the thing, we all struggle. We all have our own sins that we struggle with. So we need to be gentle and loving and kind with one another. But you know the kind of person who said they were one way, and then you discover that for years they were living a completely different way. That's really discouraging, and it hurts. And if you've experienced that before, you know what I'm talking about. And so while it hurts to see somebody claim to be one way and then actually be a different way, it's also very refreshing to come across somebody who's real. We'll call them refreshingly real. The kind of person that what you see is what you get. Now, I'm not talking about the kind of person who uses what you see is what you get as an excuse to be a jerk. Because you've run across that kind of person before who's like, hey, I'm really real, so I'm going to say whatever I want to. No, I'm talking about the person who is real and Christ-like. Man, that's refreshing to run across someone like that. And the reason I think it's refreshing is because, unfortunately, it's rare. You just don't see that kind of person as often as we should or want to. If I'm honest, I struggle, and I'm guessing most of us are this way. I struggle with being real sometimes. Now, what's tricky for me, and where I'll really share with you, I think I can come across with a pretty real vibe. Like I can look like I'm being real and act real and just be kind of natural about things. But that doesn't mean that I'm really sharing everything. I may be real or seem real, but maybe nobody knows about my struggles or my victories. And I'm guessing that there's several people in the room like that you can come across pretty real, but there's some stuff that's just not coming out, that you're not showing the real side. You're not being real. And that's tough, and I think that's something that a lot of Christians struggle with, and it's something that we wrestle with. And here's the unfortunate thing. I think one of the places, if we were to locate this lack of realness, I think one of the places that we struggle with the most is right inside the walls of our church building. Because we get out of the car, and this is kind of funny, it's the stereotype, we fight all the way to church, and then we get to church, we're like, okay, chill it, everybody stop crying, stop yelling, and let's put our masks on, and come in and put a smile on our face and act like everything's fine. And that's kind of funny, and sometimes we're honest, if you had kids especially, sometimes that happens. But that's why I like the 35-minute drive, right? We've got plenty of time to get here and get chilled out after rushing out of the house. Some of you have like 2 minutes to get chilled out after you get out of the house. And so you've been like that and you've experienced that. But it's unfortunate that when we get here, of all places, the one place where we ought to be able to be real, we put those masks on and we fake it sometimes. Jesus uses a word in the New Testament that was used outside of the New Testament to refer to someone who was an actor. And so imagine in the New Testament, here's this word that describes someone who acts in a play. You know what an actor does? An actor pretends to be someone that he's not. And in the first century or during ancient theater, they would have masks that they would cover their face with, and they would hold a mask. And sometimes they'd play multiple parts, and so they'd go off stage and come out with a different mask. And Jesus takes that word and uses it in the New Testament. It's the word today that we use the word hypocrite to translate that Greek word. And it's just a word that means actor. And so Jesus says there were people, and he uses this word several times, there are people among you who are acting, not on a stage in a play, but acting in their faith. And so they're one way in real life, but when they get around other religious people or out in front of people, they put on a mask, and it's a completely different person. And he describes that type of person as a hypocrite. Turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 23. This is where he does this very explicitly in one of the harsher passages of the New Testament. Matthew chapter 23. And in this chapter, Jesus issues 7 woes, W-O-E, toward the Pharisees. So there's 7 of them. 6 of those 7 times, it goes like this. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, and then there's that word, hypocrites. 6 times in this passage, he says, okay, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, actors, fakers. I want to come back to the passage that we just read a moment ago during the scripture reading as one example of how Jesus called the Pharisees. And if you're a guest with us today, we're in this series called Accidental Pharisees. And we've addressed some ways that we can accidentally become Pharisees. And today is another one of those ways, though slightly different from what we've talked about. And Jesus says to the Pharisees of the day, listen, you guys are fakers. You're acting like it's a stage. Here's how he does it in verses 25 to 28. So Matthew 23, starting in verse 25 again. He says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, actors, fakers. For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate. The outside also may be clean. In other words, you look great on the outside. Everything's clean and polished and nice. But the real you, the inside, is a mess. Verse 27, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also appear righteous, outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Jesus' condemnation of the Pharisees was, you guys are faking. And in a negative way, they made everything look good, but on the inside they were full of dead men's bones. It was uncleanness and unrighteousness. He does this a couple other times in Matthew, fairly harshly. Go over to Matthew chapter 6. And this is a passage that you would know well. Matthew chapter 6. Starting in verse 1, Jesus says, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. So when you do good things, don't do those good things to be seen by people or with the purpose of being seen by others. And then through this passage, he's going to give 3 examples of ways that people do this, and he calls them hypocrites. Look at verse 2, very next verse. Thus when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogue, as the actors do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. So when you give, don't do it like the fakers do it, just to be seen by other people. Skip to verse 5. And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites. Don't pray with the goal of being seen by other people. You skip to verse 16, he says the same thing about fasting. And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces that their fasting may be seen by others. So Jesus says, listen, when you do good things in the name of Jesus, in the name of our Father, don't do it to be seen by others. When you do that, you're a hypocrite, you're a play actor, you're a faker. One other time in the Gospels, specifically in Matthew, he says something fairly direct in Matthew chapter 15. If you want to skip over there. Matthew chapter 15. Now in verse 1, note that he's talking to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, all right? So this is directly towards the Pharisees. And let's just skip to verse 7. You hypocrites. Well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Jesus says, okay, your heart isn't in the right place, but externally everything looks fine, and you're a hypocrite. Let me show you one more passage that describes what a hypocrite might look like, and that comes in one of Paul's letters. Go to Galatians Chapter 2. So let me set the scene for you. In the early days of the church, there was this conflict, this drama between the Gentiles and the Jews. The Jews heard the message first. They were God's chosen people. They became followers of Jesus first, some of them at least. And then the gospel went to the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people. And so what Jewish people said was, hey, if you're going to be a follower of Jesus or follower of God through Jesus today, that's fine, you Gentiles, but you've still got to follow the Jewish law. Like, you still got to keep our rules, because we've been keeping these rules, God's rules, for generations. So you got to keep the Sabbath. And really challenging for Gentile men, you got to get circumcised. If you're going to follow God, you got to do this. And so Paul and others come along and say, no, you're saved by faith in Jesus, not by the works of the law. And so there was this constant tension that Paul addresses. And one time, he was in the city of Antioch, and they were wrestling with this tension between the Jews and the Gentiles, and they thought they had it figured out. The Jews and the Gentiles were getting along. And in fact, Peter, famous guy, right? Probably the most famous guy in the early church, right alongside Paul. He comes up to Antioch, and he's eating and hanging out with the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people. And Peter's a Jew. I mean, one of the initial followers of Jesus. And he's a Jewish guy, but he's hanging out with the Gentiles. But then some other Jewish people come up to Antioch from Jerusalem north, and Peter all of a sudden feels kind of weird about it. And all of a sudden, with these other Jewish people who kind of are weird about Gentiles, Peter stops hanging out with and eating with the Gentiles and just hangs out with his Jewish friends. And watch what Paul says about him. This is Galatians chapter 2, verse 11. But when Cephas, that's Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. This might be one of the most awkward passages in all of the New Testament, right? I mean, here's Paul calling out directly Peter for one of his sins. This is a little awkward. Here's why he called him out. Verse 12, for before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party, or the people who thought the Gentiles needed to be good Jews to be Christians. Look at verse 13. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically. The New King James says they played the hypocrite. I like also the ESV, acted hypocritically. You get the idea. All of a sudden, they're faking it. They're acting hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. So Paul says, when you're one way around some people, and then you're another way around other people, you're being a hypocrite. Now, here's where this, I think, applies to our series today. And this is a break from, I've been pointing out a book that we've kind of been following, and I'm kind of stepping away from the book for this week. We've got 2 more weeks of this series, and we'll go back to some of those ideas. But here's where I think we struggle with this. This is a strong word, the word hypocrite. And I think it's probably too strong for what I'm trying to say today, but the whole concept of acting and pretending, I think is something that we do need to hear. Because here's the temptation. The temptation is to arrive at this building, get out of our car, put a mask on, walk in the building, and be someone that we're not. We're tempted to be like an actor or an actress in a play or in a movie and pretend that we're someone that we're not. And unfortunately, this building becomes our biggest stage for acting. And of all places, this should not be the place where we pretend and act like someone we're not and put on a show in the place that we're not real. Because this is the place where we gather as a family. And if there's any place we should be real and authentic and share who we genuinely are and share what we're struggling, this should be the place. Now, I know some of you are saying, well, this is just a building. Buildings don't matter in the grand scheme of things. If this building were to get blown away tonight, we are still the church at Stantonville. Yeah, I get that. But there is a sense, I think, in which this building is special because this is kind of like our home. If we are a family, this is the place where we gather. So this is a special and important place. And this place should not be a stage for acting. It should be a place for family to be real and authentic with one another. Now, I'm not calling us hypocrites, but I am taking that word and saying maybe sometimes we act a little bit. And we're not as real as we should be. So here's my challenge to you this morning. It's simple. This is probably the simplest and least complex message I want you to hear out of this whole series. And this is it. We are a family, not actors on a stage. So take off the mask and be real. My challenge to you is to be authentic. Not show up here and be fake and pretend like everything is okay when in reality sometimes it's not. And it's okay sometimes when it's not. Because that's life and that's the experience of everybody in this room. There are times in life that are hard and difficult and we suffer and we hurt. And if we're a family, we need to be real about that and not pretend like everything is fine and okay. So here's what I would challenge you to ask this morning. I want you to ask yourself this question. How authentic am I when I show up at this building? Got some guests this morning, so you can think of it from the perspective of your church building. If you go to church somewhere else, how authentic are you when you walk in to that building? Now, I'm guessing that for some of us, we struggle with this a little bit, and maybe this looks different ways for different people. Sometimes I like to joke about a preacher voice, you know, the type that the preacher walks around and he talks normal, but then when he steps in the pulpit, it's just something like this. Good to see you, brothers and sisters. And you do the fake laugh, and it's off-putting, isn't it? And it's obvious, and you can see it very easily. So maybe it's just by the way you talk, and hopefully you don't have a preacher voice, because if you do, I'll just make fun of you to your face, all right? So maybe you don't have that, but you walk in and you just sound a little bit different when you walk in here. This morning, I did a little bit of an experiment, and I just did it because I knew I was talking about this. And so I intentionally, very quickly said to people, hey, how are you? Just repeatedly. And I was fairly brief about it. Almost curt, just kind of short. Hey, how are you? Just to see what people would say. And nearly everybody said something like, fine, how are you? Fine, how are you? That's how we do it, right? Now, I'm guessing, not everybody said that, but I'm guessing some of you that said, fine, how are you, actually are not fine. Maybe there's something going on. Now, I get it. That's just the greeting in our culture. And so when I say, hey, how are you, that's just me saying hey to you. And you don't have to then describe everything that's going on in your life. But I think sometimes we're not real with one another. And in a sense, we're putting on a mask, and maybe we're not full-fledged hypocrites, and we don't intend to do it, but we've slipped into being an accidental Pharisee. And I don't want to be that way. I love what Paul does in 2 Corinthians 1. This is the last place I'll ask you to turn. Got a couple more verses on the screen, but in 2 Corinthians, Paul is trying to prove that he's an actual apostle. All right, so there's some guys who come along to Corinth and say, Paul's not the real deal. He's a fake. He's a faker. And so Paul in 2 Corinthians is saying, listen, those guys are wrong. I'm the real deal. Let me prove that to you. And he actually brags some, and he even says, this is foolishness that I have to do this. And so if there's any letter that Paul could have tried to kind of put on a good front and say, hey, I'm the man here. I'm actually an apostle. It was 2 Corinthians. But watch how he begins. Just look at what he says in chapter 1, verse 8. For we do not want you to be ignorant, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Now, I'm not saying when you walk in the door that if I say, hey, how are you? You just be like, well, this week it was so bad that I despaired of life itself. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, though, I'm calling us to some honesty and authenticity. Here's a letter in which Paul could have said, hey, everything's great, I'm an apostle. But no, he is honest. He says, I despaired of life itself. Verse 9, indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him we have set our hope that he will deliver us again. You also must help us in prayer, by prayer, so that many will give thanks on our behalf for the blessing granted us through the prayers of many. Paul is completely authentic and honest about his struggle and what he's been through. So, the challenge is simple. I'm just saying, listen, if we are a family and this is our meeting place, and when we show up here, let's be real with one another. Let's not fake it. Let's take off the masks and be honest. And let me tell you why you should do this. Before I tell you why you should do this, let me tell you, you ought to stay for second class today, because I think this is an opportunity to talk about kind of a tough issue, maybe an opportunity to open up, but an opportunity to say, okay, why don't we do this? Why do we struggle with this? How can we do better? So I think it'll be a really interesting conversation. But let me give you a couple reasons why you should do this morning and try to be more real. Here's the first one, because we need each other. We need to be real with one another because we need each other. Now, you know the passages. There are dozens of them in the New Testament that call us to fill in the blank to one another. So it's forgive one another, be kind to one another, love one another. Galatians Chapter 6, verse 2, bear one another's burdens. But listen, we cannot be there for one another if we are not real with one another. We can't. I can't be there for you if I don't know what's going on. And you can't be there for me if you don't know what's going on. We can't be there for one another if we don't know what's going on, if we're not real with one another. There's a couple of passages where Paul calls us to be, Paul and then Peter calls us to be genuine. Here they are on the screen. Romans 12, verse 9, let love be genuine. 1 Peter 1, verse 22, having purified your souls by obedience to the truth for a sincere brotherly love, love one another earnestly from a pure heart. So in both places, Paul and then Peter say, hey, love needs to be sincere. What's really cool about that word, genuine and sincere, it's the same word in Greek. And it's a word that means, Paul and Peter take the word for hypocrite, and they add a prefix to it to make it mean not hypocritical. So it's just a word that means unhypocritical, if that is a word. So Paul says, let your love not be hypocritical. Peter says, you've obeyed the truth for a non-hypocritical brotherly love. So we are called to love one another sincerely or genuinely, not to be actors about it, not to be fake about it, but to be real about it. And here's the thing. We can't do this, I don't think. We cannot obey Paul and Peter's command to genuine, unhypocritical love if we are not real with one another. We need each other. We need to do this for one another. Here's the deal. Have you ever been in a situation where maybe someone comes forward and is very real about what they're struggling? And you know what? I love that people feel like they can do that here. Now, when someone does that, what's that do for you? For me, it challenges me to be more open and more real. And maybe if you were to choose to be more real and try to do this and try to be more intentional about it, that might challenge someone else to be more real. Now, let me say up front, and I haven't said this, I think we've got a head start on this. There's a reason that a lot of us come here. There's a reason students come here. There's a reason I want to be here and I want my family here. And I think it's because we are pretty real. That's a part of who we are, and we've got a culture of realness, and I'm thankful for that. And so I feel like we've got a head start in this. But just because we have a head start doesn't mean we can't improve. Doesn't mean we can't grow. Doesn't mean those of us who struggle to be real. There's some real people here, but there's some of us who aren't. Who put on a show, who put on the face and act like everything's fine when sometimes it's not. So maybe it's time, while we have a head start, to step up our realness and be genuine and authentic. Why? Because we need each other, and we can't be there for one another if we're not real with one another. Here's the second reason that I think you ought to do this, that we need to be real, because people are drawn to real. People are drawn to this. Do you believe that, let's go one side of this, are people put off by fake? Yeah. You've been around it before. You've seen fake people. We don't like to be around fake people. Simple. It's easy to see. On the other side, aren't you drawn to someone who is real? Now, sometimes they might make you feel a little uncomfortable because it pushes you to be real, but aren't you drawn to people who are real and genuine? Yes. So wouldn't it make sense then that if we are real and show authentic, genuine love and are authentic with one another, that's going to draw people maybe to us at first, but ultimately to Jesus? And wouldn't that, if you don't like this at all, if you're like, no, that's just not me, I can't do this, well, let me give you a reason that trumps it all. Here's why you ought to do this. Here's why you ought to be real. Because others are watching, and when they see you being real, it may just draw them to Jesus Christ. It is not about you. This is about Jesus. This is about the glory of God. And so when we do this well, we're pointing people to Jesus. In 2013, Barna did some research on the generation that had reached their 20s and early 30s by that point in time. And the surveys or the statistics showed that about 60% of them who had grown up in church in general were no longer in church. So they asked, okay, why? For the 40% who stayed, why did they stay? And they came up with 5 different reasons as to why they stayed. 2 of them, I think, are relevant to this. One of the reasons was the people who stayed after their teenage years, once they left home, the 40% who stayed, said they stayed because they found meaningful relationships. Are meaningful relationships ever fake? No, meaningful relationships are real and authentic. So I think part of that is saying they stayed because they found authenticity. They saw real people. But then one of the other 5 reasons that they stayed was they said they found true intimacy with Jesus. Like they were shown how to develop intimacy with Jesus. Now, intimacy with Jesus, is that fake? You might be able to fake it a little while, but not very long. That's real. And so for the generation, really just the generation just after me, and not really the one that our college students are in any longer, they're kind of the next generation, they said, here's the reason we stayed. Part of it was they found authenticity in their experiences growing up. And the ones who did not find authenticity didn't stay. Now, sometimes you hear the old excuse from people in our communities, in our culture, well, I'm not going to go to church because they're a bunch of hypocrites. You ever heard that one before? And you know what? Sometimes that's reasonable. Not reasonable not to come to church, but reasonable to say, yeah, I experienced a bunch of hypocrites. They're one way at the church building, and then there's something different the rest of the week. And that ought to be a call to us to be disciples of Jesus, followers of Jesus all week long, but it also ought to remind us that when we're real, when we're authentic with one another, it might just draw people. People might see that and say, you know what? There are not a lot of authentic people in our world. I want to be a part of a group of people that is. So now all of a sudden, this isn't about you. This isn't about me. This isn't even about our church. You ought to be real because it might draw people to Jesus Christ. This is about mission, and that makes it worth it. So again, I want to challenge you this morning to just ask, am I being authentic when I show up at this building? Or am I somebody different here, or I'm not completely real, or I put the mask up? Am I being authentic? Am I being real when I walk into the walls of this building? Because as a family, if we are a family, we ought to be able to be real with one another. As I think about the call to be real and why we should do this, and that we're a church and we're a part of one another, I can't help but think of what Paul says to the elders at Ephesus in Acts chapter 20. He talks about the church that they were shepherds over, and he adds this little statement. He describes the church of God and then says, which Jesus bought with his own blood. So as a church, Jesus purchased us with his blood, which means he didn't just die for you. He did die for you, and that's a cool thought and a helpful thought, and I'll say that sometimes up here. But it wasn't just about you. When he bought something with his blood, he bought this whole family. He bought us as an entity, as a group, which means we belong together, which also means you can't have a relationship with Jesus outside of being part of a family. You've got to be a part of the family that Jesus bought with his blood, because he did die for you, but he died for this family as well. And so if you've never put Christ on in baptism to receive the forgiveness of sins, to be bought back from Satan, and to be a part of his church, then wow, today's a great day to do that. And we'd love to talk with you about that or study more with you about that if you got questions about it, or we can do it right now. But maybe today is the day that you're ready to be real. Maybe that's not publicly. You know what? Maybe you just need to talk to a couple people or someone. You've got something going on and it's time to share that with somebody. Please do that. don't fake it anymore. We're a family. But maybe today, and as we've seen example over and over again of people who've been willing to do this, maybe you want to share a burden. Maybe you want to be real with this whole family. And we would love to help you, and you know you're going to be surrounded and prayed for right here, right now. As many of you know, I think, that we got into camping this summer, and not tent camping, good grief, no. We actually did that one time with several people from church, and we were like, yeah, that's enough of that. We want to be like them and have a camper. So we've been doing the camping thing this summer, and I guess back in July, it was our second time out, and we went to Natchez Trace Park up above Lexington. And when you pull into a place like that, for me, there's this balance between trying to look the part and act the part, and then trying to be real. Justin's smiling right now because he knows that I'm not really the part of this. Those of you who know me well know I am not mechanically inclined. Turns out with a camper, there's multiple pieces moving, and it's kind of mechanical, right? So I have learned this summer. It's been a steep learning curve, and it's been good for me, and I'm proud of how far I've come. But when I pull into this particular setting, when you pull into any campsite or campground, there are people watching, right? Well, they're checking out your camper, and then they're watching to see how you back that thing in, right? And I do it too, and so I'll never forget pulling up, and I was kind of backing to the right, and off to the left, right there was this big old group of people who looked like they knew what they were doing, just watching. So my window was down, and I said, hey guys, I'm a rookie. I pulled the rookie card, and I was being real. I do not know what I'm doing. And then, mind you, I proceeded to back that thing in perfectly on the first try, right? All right, so take that, those of you who are waiting for the funny part of the story. But here comes the funny part of the story. We were fixing to leave, and I could not get, and I don't even know the right words, I could not get it to hitch up and connect. So I did what any person like me would do, and I took a hammer to it, right? And I was trying to hammer that thing that the lock, I don't know the words. Anyway, yeah, you get it. So I hammer that thing down, and man, I was going at it. And Justin, you can laugh, but you're the first person to hammer on it just a little bit. Well, I went to town on it. I learned from Justin, okay, thing needs to be hammered. Well, about that time, one of those guys from across the road kind of peeked around the corner of my truck, and he said, what are you doing? I said, I am trying to get this thing. It's stuck. It won't go. And then he said, maybe you should stop hammering on it for a second. And he said, I heard that hammering from across the way, and I thought, he does not need to be doing that. And so he came, and he helped me. A couple other guys came and helped me, and it turns out I'd bent it, so they helped me to bend it back in place. But they came to help me and rescue me before I had broken it. Now, here's why I think they did it. I think they did it because I had been honest when I came in. When I pulled into that campground, I looked at them and smiled and said, hey, I'm a rookie. I don't know what I'm doing. Now, had I pulled up and been like, yeah, look at me, and then backed that thing in there perfectly as I did, mind you, they might have been like, well, what a punk. We're not going to go help that guy. I think they helped me because at least in that case, I pulled in that campground, and I was real with them. And I was honest, and they could get that, and so they stepped in and helped me. Here's what happens in life. All of us are going to get in messes. And sometimes we take hammers to things that we shouldn't take hammers to. And we bend things. And in life, sometimes we bend them far enough that they break. But I think if we're honest with one another and real with one another, when we get in those difficult situations, our church family will step in and help us before things break. Now, you know what? They might have to help us bend things back into place because we'll get things bent out of, we'll mess it up pretty bad sometimes. But as a family, when we're real and honest with one another, we help each other and we bend things back into place. And so if you're in a spot where maybe you've got some burdens or there's some things that are not good and you've got a mess, instead of trying to take a hammer to it to yourself, why don't you be real with this family so that we can help one another bend things back into place with the help of God before things break.